Hi everybody, it's Thomas here from thomasfitzgeraldphotography.com with another Patreon exclusive video. This is our second video looking at editing some images from start to finish, and in this video I'm looking at some photos I took of Galway Harbour on the summer solstice at sunset. So basically we had headed to Galway and we wanted to capture the sunset on the longest day of the year. Unfortunately the sky was quite cloudy, but we did still get some dramatic imagery. So I have a selection of these and I'm going to show you how I edit them from start to finish. So let's jump right in and here we go. Okay, so to start with, let's look at this image. Okay, so this was taken on a Fuji X Pro 2. I shot it on a tripod and it's kind of a long exposure. It's not very long actually, it's just over 1/7 of a second. So I've already run these through Irradiant X Transformer just to bring out a bit more detail, and because there was some kind of the usual Lightroom muddiness going on in some of the detail and the rocks and stuff. So I've done that, I've brought them all in, and I've set the color profile. Oh, actually no, I need to set the color profile to Provia. Okay. So what I want to do is, it's a pretty good image as it is. It's okay, but it's a bit flat. So we want to bring it up and bring out some of the colors in the sky and the detail in the rocks and stuff. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to straighten the image because it's a little bit crooked, as you can see. Okay, and then next thing we're going to do is just some kind of overall tweaking. So we play around with the shadows. I want to bring this up a little bit. Let's go down. A bit of clarity. These are the kind of things I do to most images of this kind. Overall, that's much better already. It's a little dark. I'm going to increase the exposure a bit. Now, these were taken at dusk, so the idea is that they are dark. So we don't want to brighten them up too much, but we still want to be able to see what's actually going on in it. Now, that's pretty good as is, but I want to bring it up some even more, and there's a little trick to this. If you have Lightroom CC as opposed to Lightroom 6, this is where the dehaze tool comes in. Now, dehaze is kind of mostly for getting rid of foggy or hazy images, but it actually works really well as an overall enhancement tool. As you can see here, I've just brought it up a bit and it's giving the image a lot of pop already. Somebody wrote to me one time and asking me, was it just did it just adjust the black levels? And it's not. It's much more complicated than that. It brings up certain colors and emphasizes certain things a bit more than others. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly the algorithm they use, but it's pretty good. Okay, so straight off, that's much better. I want to kind of give a bit more detail in the skies, so I'm going to add a gradient to this as well. And again, use clarity, a bit more dehaze. I don't want to go too much because it's starting to get a bit noisy, as you can see. But even at that, that's much better. Okay, and then one last thing I want to do is, there's a dust spot here, so we need to fix that. Okay. We're getting a little grain in here, but this is to be expected because I've increased the exposure a good bit and I've brought the shadows up so much, so there's going to be grain. There's not much you can do about that, and it kind of adds to the image anyway. It's not a big deal. So yeah, so straight up, that's much better. And we don't want to overdo it either, so the one thing I do want to just check is how this looks against white, because one of the things you can find sometimes is an image can look dark when you eventually post it to your website or online, or even when you print it out, and it looks perfectly fine when you're editing in Lightroom. And the reason for that is the darker background will make images look brighter than they actually are. Having said that, I still prefer a darker background when editing, but if you can see the difference, it's probably not that visible on the video, but it's a perceptual thing. So but I am going to bring this brightness up slightly, and what I'm going to do for that is I'm actually going to use the whites rather than exposure. And the reason for this is the white levels kind of acts like an overall volume control. So if you look at the histogram, you can see, if you imagine all the areas of the histogram from here to here, if I was to just grab it at this point and drag it across, so if you imagine you could actually physically drag the histogram, that's what adjusting the white levels would be. So if you watch the histogram as I adjust it, you see it's a linear adjustment. So it acts almost like a volume control. And I'm just going to make sure there's no clipping. Oh, everything looks fine. Okay, so there we have it. So that's that first image done. I'm pretty happy with that. And just to show you where we started, let's go back to the crop. So there, after we cropped it, there's our finished image. Okay, so in the next one, I've actually shot 3 images, and I shot them bracketed. And the reason for this was I wanted to get as much information as possible. So I could do one of 2 things. I could use it to find the best exposure and the exposure that was most suitable, or alternatively I can combine these into a HDR image. Now I find that's, and based on some of the comments people have sent to me over the years and some of the things people write to me about, there's a certain degree of confusion over just what you can do with a RAW file. And if you're fairly advanced in experience, you probably know this already, but I'm going to use these bracketed exposures just to show you what I mean. So here is this was the actual correct exposure, or at least this was a 0 exposure. The scene when we were there was probably a little bit brighter than this, but that's kind of roughly what we were looking at. Then this is the overexposed image from the bracket, and then this is the underexposed image. Now, if you look at all of these, they all contain enough data to extract from. However, if I bring this up, you'll actually get a lot of noise in the image. So even though, particularly with, say, the likes of the Fuji camera that I'm shooting this with, there's a reputation that, you know, it's got great dynamic range, you can recover, and there's this whole reputation of ISO and variance that I think is a little misunderstood. But again, so I'm going to bring this exposure up to match the +1. Okay, so I'm not losing any detail here. Everything is here. However, if I look at the +1 exposure, I'm going to match these as best I can just to show you what I mean. So bring that up another little bit. Okay, so it's close enough for a moment. Okay, so here's the underexposed one, and I brought this up +2. So if I look down here at the shadow areas, and I'm going to zoom in just a bit because this on the video might be hard to see, and you can see this is quite noisy. But if I look at the correct exposure, or the +1 exposure, where this was actually exposed this way in the camera, you can see there's no noise at all. Okay, and that's the difference it makes. That's why it's always important to try and get your exposure as close as possible in camera. So yeah, so that's just a piece of useless information for you. Let me just put this back. Now, the other thing I'm going to do is, by combining the 3Ds into a HDR image, I'm not going to create some mad, dramatic, overly processed image. So basically, what happens when you combine the 3Ds, even though we're not going to create something overly dramatic, is you're basically expanding the data. So if you imagine your full 12 or 14 bits of raw data for this particular set of exposure, and you're combining it with this and this, you're basically expanding what you have to play with. So this means as we adjust and manipulate the image, we actually have more to play with, so the image becomes more malleable. And in essence, what that means, as we bring up the shadows and stuff, we don't get the dark, we don't get the noise in the darks as you would have with what I showed you previously. So to merge these in Lightroom, you just simply select them all, right click on them and go photo merge HDR and set your parameters. Now I've already done this just to save a bit of time, so here's what we merged, and I have this zeroed out just so we can show you what I mean. I'm going to leave this at Provia again. Okay, so I want to get about doing some of the adjustments on this. So I'll start with my exposure, just bring it up a bit. And again, increase our contrast, clarity, and bring up our shadows a bit. Again, it's the same thing here. I don't want to make this too bright because it was dark at the time, and we do want to make it more dramatic, but I also don't want to take too much away from the fact that this was a dusk image. So again, bring up dehaze. Again, trying not to go too far in this. I think I'll bring up our vibrance a bit. Okay, see, already that's much better. I do want to bring up the shadows a bit more here and maybe make the sky a bit more dramatic. So again, we will use our gradient tool and a bit more clarity in the sky. I don't want to go too far with this again. See, that's very dramatic, but it's also quite fake looking. So, but we'll bring it up a little bit. Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, so back in here, and we'll add another one, another gradient, and we want to bring up the foreground a bit more. So again, we'll just bring up the shadows a bit, maybe a bit more clarity. Again, we don't want to go too far. The one thing you need to be careful of in Lightroom is if you're adjusting clarity and if you're adjusting shadows and highlights, you can end up with some halos around bright and dark areas, so you just need to be careful of that. So I'm just checking for those halos, too far. But everything looks fine. And again, we don't have excessive shadow noise here, so that's again the reason why we're using the HDR method. And I think that's pretty good. So again, if we look, this is where we started, and this is where we ended up. So again, I think that's pretty good. Now, again, I have another set of 3 images here for the next one. So again, I have already combined these just to make life a bit easier. So overall, this is quite underexposed. Well, it's quite flat. So, and also the framing is not great. However, I think it's going to make a nice panorama. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to crop it first. So we want to, no, I don't want to do that. Let me just undo that for a second. So I want to crop it into panorama. And the aspect ratio I want is 2.35 to 1, which I've entered by using custom. And what this particular ratio is it's CinemaScope, so it's what you would see in the movies on a really widescreen image. So I'm going to crop this. Okay, and I'm going to set my background to dark, which again, just for the editing purpose, because it just makes it a bit easier to see what's going on. Normally I leave this at grey, because you kind of want to give it a reasonable idea, and you don't want it to subtly affect it too much, but because this is a nice scope image, or a nice panoramic image, I want it black just because it looks better. Okay, so here we go. We'll just do basics first. So contrast. By the way, if you don't know this already, you can adjust all the main controls in Lightroom by dragging on the histogram up here. So if I do this, I'm adjusting the exposure. And here's shadows, blacks, and then highlights, and whites. Okay, so clarity, bit of vibrance, and again, the amazing dehaze. Okay, and then we'll just bring our shadows up, because we want to emphasize the rocks a bit. Maybe bring our clarity up a bit too more, and just the overall brightness levels. Okay, and straight away this looks pretty good. Again, we'll see if we can get a bit more drama in the sky by using a gradient and bring up the dehaze a bit. Again, try not to go too far because we don't want to overdo it. And you know what, I can try the same trick down here on the beach. The shadows a bit more. Okay, and I'm just going to check to make sure I haven't overdone it, so it's not too noisy. Oh, that all looks okay. Okay, so that image looks much better. Again, if we go back to our where we started with the crop, you can see we've gone from there to that, which is pretty good. And also too, because we've merged 3 images and it's a 32-bit file now, you can adjust it much more and still maintain data integrity. So it's not like, if you were to do this to a single file, it would be much noisier. So that's again another reason why I sometimes combine images like this, just to get a little bit of extra data. Okay, so the last one we have, actually I'm going to mark this as red so we can go back to it in a minute. So then this is the last image we have, and again we have our 3 files, which I've already combined. Probably could get away with just using this one or this one, because all our data is there. But again, because I have them, I've combined them. So let's just go with this. Again, just our exposure bit and our contrast, clarity. Bring our shadows up. See, straight away, that's even now as is, it's starting to look good. This was actually later in the evening, so you can see it's gotten much bluer. So you can see how the light changes as you progress, even over the period of about an hour. It actually makes a big difference when you're near enough to sunset. I'm going to set this to Provia. That should be in Provia. Incidentally, if I look at Velvia on this, I think Velvia makes it a bit too purple. So I prefer Provia. It's kind of more natural looking. I'm not going to do too much dehaze to this one because it's already pretty strong. But if we bring it up a little bit, you can see that very dramatic. But again, we're still a bit dark, so I'm going to bring the exposure up a bit more. And I like what's going on in the sky, but I think the foreground I might be able to bring it up a bit more. So we'll do a gradient on it. And bring the clarity up a bit more. And maybe just a little bit on the exposure. And what I might do is just a bit of a vignette then to kind of balance everything out. And the saturation up slightly as well. Because there's some nice colours in the seaweed and stuff here. And the composition worked quite well on this. You've got your leading lines, rule of thirds, and I think overall this is a pretty good image. And the nice dramatic sky helps as well. And let me just, speaking of dramatic sky, I'll see if we can just bring this a bit more. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try a little vignette on this, and I'm going to look through my presets, and I have a good vignette in my Steely Blue presets, so I think it's vignette light. See what this looks like. Okay, it's making it too dark, that's a bit too much. I need a lighter one than that, but I can just tweak it. Just a midpoint back a bit. What I really just want to do is just kind of darken the edges ever so slightly, just to focus the attention in. And I think that is... yeah, that's pretty good. I'm happy with that. Okay, so again, let me just go back to our history palette. So there's before. And there's after. So there we have it. That's pretty much how I went and tweaked these images. For Patreon members, I'm going to put some of the raw files for this. Actually, I'll put some of the DNGs. I'll put the DNGs of this one, and I'll put the two. I'll put the two HDR DNGs in the Patreon link, so you can get a look. And once again, thank you for being Patreon supporters. I hope you've liked this little video. I hope it's been useful to you and you've got some good tips out of it. Yes, thank you again for being Patreon supporters, and we'll see you next time. Okay, thank you very much.